The moment Marcus Holt introduced me to his colleagues as just a retired plumber, I saw the flicker of dismissal cross their polished faces, and I decided to say nothing. Not yet. My name is Daniel Mercer, and I have spent 61 years on this earth learning one inescapable truth. The most dangerous man in any room is the one nobody bothers to impress. I was wearing my usual Saturday clothes, broken-in work boots, dark jeans with a slight fade at the knees, and a plain navy flannel shirt that my daughter Sarah had once tried to throw away and replace with something she called more appropriate for a man of your station. I had fished it out of the donation bag and worn it specifically to spite the notion that a man needed to perform wealth in order to possess it. I had been performing something else my entire life. Competence. The kind that doesn't announce itself. Marcus had insisted I come to the open house. His firm, Holt and Greystone Realty, was debuting what he called the crown jewel listing of the decade, a 4,200 square foot colonial revival on Ashford Lane that had been sitting on the market for 7 months because every buyer who walked through fell in love with the architecture and then discovered the infrastructure of the house was a disaster. Plumbing from 1987 that had never been properly updated. A boiler system that was held together with what the previous inspector charitably called creative engineering. HVAC ductwork that ran through the walls like a maze designed by someone who had learned about ventilation from a dream. Marcus had asked me along because Sarah had mentioned, almost offhandedly, that her father knew a little something about pipes. Marcus had interpreted this the way most 34-year-old men with business degrees and monogrammed cufflinks interpret information delivered by wives about their fathers. As a minor footnote, useful perhaps for a 10-minute consultation before the real professionals took over. What Sarah had actually meant, and what she had been too modest, or perhaps too amused, to elaborate on, was that her father had spent 32 years as a licensed master plumber before retiring, that her father held 3 patents related to modern pressurized flow systems used in commercial construction across 14 states, that her father had been called as an expert witness in 2 federal cases involving building code violations, that her father had, over the course of his career, consulted on the infrastructure of buildings worth collectively somewhere north of $2 billion. But I was wearing a flannel shirt, so. The Ashford Lane property was genuinely beautiful from the outside. A wide, covered porch wrapped around the front and side of the house, crown molding detail on the exterior eaves, deep-set windows with original divided lights. Someone had planted Japanese maples along the front walk that were just beginning to turn, their leaves catching the October light in shades of copper and burgundy. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and let myself appreciate it before going inside. Marcus met me at the door with the particular energy of a man managing multiple important things at once. He was handsome in a sharp, architectural way, square jaw, dark hair slicked back, wearing a charcoal suit that fit him so well it was clearly not off the rack. He had an earpiece in one ear and a tablet in his hand, and he greeted me with the half-hug of someone who is also checking their phone while doing it. "Daniel, glad you could make it. Listen, we've got a couple of serious buyers coming through in about an hour, so if you could just take a quick look at the boiler room and maybe give me a sense of whether we're talking a $10,000 fix or a $100,000 fix, that would be incredibly helpful." He was already steering me toward the side entrance. "I told the team you were a retired plumber, so they know you're here in kind of an informal capacity. Don't worry about the open house setup, that's handled." I noticed the woman nearest to us, a young agent in a cream blazer, professionally beautiful in the way of people who have studied how to be professionally beautiful, absorb the phrase, retired plumber, and make the micro-adjustment that people make when they're reclassifying a person from potential important to background presence. Her eyes slid off me and back to her clipboard. "Sure," I said, "I'll take a look." Marcus clapped me on the shoulder with the affection of a man who believes he is being generous, and directed me toward a door near the kitchen. I went. The basement was, as suspected, a monument to decades of deferred maintenance and optimistic improvisation. I stood in the boiler room for a long moment, just looking, not touching anything yet, just reading the room the way you learn to read a room after 32 years. The original boiler was a Burnham Series 2 from, I checked the stamp, 1991. Remarkable that it was still running. Less remarkable when I looked at the patchwork of newer components bolted onto it at various points over the years, each repair layered over the previous one like geological strata. Someone had replaced the circulator pump within the last 5 years. Decent work, actually, clean installation. But the expansion tank was original and was almost certainly waterlogged, which would cause pressure fluctuations throughout the system. The pressure relief valve had a visible mineral crust around its base that suggested it had been weeping for months, possibly longer. I moved to the main plumbing stack. Here is where it got interesting. The original cast iron drain stack was intact, good news, because replacing a cast iron stack in a house this size was not a small project. But someone, at some point in the 1990s, had connected a series of ABS plastic drain lines to the cast iron using rubber mission couplings, which was standard practice, except that several of these couplings had been installed with the clamps significantly under-torqued, and 2 of them were showing the early signs of what would eventually become a leak. Not a drip, but a seep. The kind that starts inside a wall and announces itself to the homeowner 6 months later as a stain on the ceiling of the room below. The supply lines were copper, which was good, but the water heater, a 50-gallon Bradford White, had a sacrificial anode rod that was, based on the age of the unit and the visible scale around the T and P valve, almost certainly completely depleted. Without that anode rod doing its job, the tank was corroding from the inside. It had maybe 8 months before it failed. When it failed, it would likely fail enthusiastically, which is a plumber's way of saying, catastrophically and in a way that damaged the surrounding structure. I took my phone out and began methodically photographing everything. I had been down there for about 20 minutes when I heard footsteps on the stairs, and Marcus appeared with another man, older, maybe 65, silver-haired, wearing a cashmere overcoat over a suit that made Marcus's good suit look like something purchased at an airport. "Daniel," Marcus said, "this is Richard Greystone, my partner." Richard Greystone. I knew that name. I paused, looking at him, and I watched the same thing happen in his face, the flicker of recognition working its way through layers of context and time. Richard Greystone stood very still for a moment. Then he said, "Daniel Mercer." Not a question. I should tell you about Richard Greystone, and to do that I need to go back 17 years. In 2008, Richard Greystone had not yet been Richard Greystone of Holt and Greystone Realty. He had been Richard Greystone of Greystone Development, a mid-sized commercial real estate development company that was in the process of constructing what was going to be its signature achievement, a 12-story mixed-use building in the Riverside district that would include retail, office space, and 48 residential units. The building was 16 months into construction when the project engineer flagged a concern about the plumbing infrastructure in the lower 6 floors. The mechanical contractor had installed the drain waste vent system using a configuration that was technically within the letter of the local code, but that was, in the judgment of the engineer, going to cause significant problems once the building was occupied. Specifically, under full load conditions, the pressure dynamics in the drain system were going to create siphoning effects at the fixture traps, which would allow sewer gas to migrate into the occupied spaces. This was not a cosmetic problem. Sewer gas is not merely unpleasant. At sufficient concentrations, it is a genuine health hazard. The mechanical contractor disputed this assessment. The dispute escalated. Greystone Development found itself needing an independent expert, someone with no financial stake in the outcome, with credentials that could not be questioned, who could evaluate the system and render a judgment. They found me. I spent 4 days at that construction site. I reviewed the drawings, walked the systems, ran pressure tests, modeled the flow conditions. At the end of 4 days, I told Richard Greystone in a conference room with his attorneys and the contractor's attorneys all present that his engineer was right. The system as installed was going to fail. Not might fail, was going to fail. I told him it would cost approximately $230,000 to remediate correctly, and that if he chose not to remediate, he would be looking at a building that could not be safely occupied, potential liability that dwarfed the remediation cost, and a signature project that became a cautionary tale instead of a legacy. Richard Greystone had sat at the head of that conference table and listened to everything I said without interrupting once. Then he had looked at his contractor and said, quietly, "Fix it." The contractor had fixed it. The building opened on schedule 8 months later. It had, as of my last knowledge, a waiting list for the residential units. Richard Greystone had sent me a handwritten thank you note afterward. I still had it somewhere. Now he was standing in the basement of the Ashford Lane Colonial, looking at me with an expression that was somewhere between surprised and deeply amused. "Daniel Mercer," he said again. He turned to Marcus. "Do you know who this is?" Marcus looked between us with the expression of a man whose Saturday had just departed from its expected itinerary. "He's Sarah's father. He's the man who saved the Riverside Tower project," Richard said. "He's the best diagnostic plumbing consultant I have ever encountered, and I have encountered several." He extended his hand to me, and his handshake was the kind that communicates genuine respect rather than the performance of it. "Daniel, what are you doing here?" "My son-in-law needed someone to look at the boiler," I said. Richard looked at Marcus. Marcus had gone a particular shade of red that I recognized as the color of a man recalibrating rapidly. "What did you find?" Richard asked, turning back to me. I showed him my phone. I walked him through the photographs, the issues, my assessment of each. He listened the way he had listened in that conference room 17 years ago, completely, without interrupting, with the full weight of his attention. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What's your total remediation estimate?" he asked. "For the boiler system, the water heater, and the drain line coupling issues. Done right, with quality components. Somewhere between $18,000 and $24,000, depending on what they find when they open the wall on the north side to access those ABS couplings. There's a chance the leak has already reached the subfloor, in which case add another $5,000 to $8,000 for remediation. So worst case, $32,000. Approximately. On a property listed at," he glanced at Marcus. 1.1, Marcus said. His voice had taken on a careful, neutral quality. "On a property listed at $1.1 million, Richard said. "The infrastructure issues are a $32,000 problem, which means the property is actually worth," he paused, calculating. "Whatever someone will pay for it once they know the truth," I said. "Which, with the disclosure done properly and the remediation either completed or priced into the offer, is probably around $1 million flat. Maybe $105 if the buyers love the bones as much as I do." Richard nodded slowly. He looked around the basement with the eyes of someone seeing it properly for the first time. "The bones are extraordinary," he said. "The best I've seen at this price point," I agreed. We went upstairs together, the three of us, and the dynamic in the room shifted in the way that dynamics shift when the people who set them are forced to reset their assumptions. The young woman in the cream blazer, her name was Tessa, I would later learn, watched Richard Greystone walk in from the basement with his hand on my shoulder, and something she clearly couldn't categorize happening in her face. Marcus's other colleague, a man named Devon who had the air of someone who played competitive tennis and wanted you to know it, stopped his conversation mid-sentence. Richard Greystone had a way of occupying space that made people pay attention, and he was paying attention to me, which meant everyone else started paying attention to me, which is the precise mechanism by which rooms change. "Gentlemen," Richard said, to no one in particular and everyone in general, "I'd like to introduce Daniel Mercer. Some of you may recognize the name. He consulted on the Riverside Tower project back in '08. Among a significant number of other commercial and residential projects, he's been good enough to take a look at the infrastructure here and give us an honest assessment." He paused, "which is more than I can say for the 2 inspection reports we've already paid for." There was a brief silence. "The previous inspectors missed the supply coupling issues," I said, because it was true and because it was useful to say it plainly rather than let it become a source of embarrassment later. "They're not obvious unless you know what you're looking for. The drain lines are behind finished drywall. You wouldn't catch it without thermal imaging or without knowing the failure pattern that particular installation method tends to produce over time." "You caught it," Richard said. "I've seen it before," I said. Devin cleared his throat. "Could the house still close, with proper disclosure?" "With proper disclosure and either completed remediation or a negotiated credit, absolutely," I said. "The structure is sound. The mechanical issues are real but bounded. A buyer who does their homework and gets a credit at closing comes out ahead. They get the work done the way they want it done, with the contractor they choose, instead of inheriting someone else's repair decisions." I watched Tessa writing notes on her clipboard. "That's actually a better sales narrative than what we have now," she said, almost to herself. "It is," Richard agreed. "The house has a story. It was built beautifully, it was maintained imperfectly, and it's waiting for an owner who understands value." He looked at her. "Lead with the bones, disclose the infrastructure, price the credit into the negotiation strategy." He paused. "That's how we move this property." The serious buyers arrived 45 minutes later, a couple in their early 40s, both architects, which explained immediately why they had fallen in love with the house and also why the inspection report had made them pause. They understood structure. They understood systems. They were the exact buyer this house deserved. Their names were Caroline and James Whitfield, and they had lost this house once already when their first offer had fallen through over the inspection findings. They had come back for the open house, Caroline told me later, because she couldn't stop thinking about the windows. Richard asked me, quietly, if I would be willing to walk the Whitfields through the basement. I looked at Marcus. Marcus, to his considerable credit, nodded without hesitation. I spent 40 minutes with James and Caroline Whitfield in the basement of the Ashford Lane Colonial. James was precise and technical and asked good questions about flow rates and pressure dynamics. Caroline was interested in the practical timeline. How long would the remediation take? Who would they call? What would the disruption look like during the work? I answered all of it honestly, including the parts that were not strictly flattering to the property. By the time we came upstairs, James Whitfield had his phone out and was texting someone. His contractor, it turned out. He was asking for availability. Caroline went directly to the window in the front sitting room, the one with the original divided lights and the view of the Japanese maples, and stood there in the afternoon light and did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "We want to make an offer." Later, after the Whitfields had left with Marcus and Tessa to begin the paperwork, Richard Greystone and I stood on the front porch with coffee from a carafe someone had set up on the hall table. "I owe you an apology," Richard said. I looked at him. "For not staying in better contact after the Riverside project," he said. "I told myself I would, and then the way things go," he gestured vaguely at the general motion of professional life. "You did remarkable work for us. I should have made sure you knew we knew it." "You sent a note," I said. "A note," he said with mild self-reproach. He took a drink of his coffee. "Your son-in-law is a good agent," he said after a moment. He is, I said, because he was. Whatever else Marcus was, he was good at his job. He didn't know what he had when he brought you in, Richard said. Not unkindly, just accurately. He knew his wife's father knew something about pipes, I said. That was enough. Richard smiled. The modesty of a man who doesn't need anyone to know. I thought about that for a moment. I spent 32 years going into basements, I said. Nobody sees you down there. Nobody cares what you're wearing or where you went to school or what your title is. They care whether the system works, whether what you say about it is true, whether the problem gets solved. I held my coffee cup in both hands and looked out at the Japanese maples, their copper leaves moving in the slight October breeze. I got comfortable being invisible. Then I retired and discovered that being invisible is actually a significant advantage, as long as you know what you're looking at. Richard was quiet for a moment. Then, I'm expanding the firm. We're taking on a number of commercial mixed-use properties in the spring, the kind of acquisitions where infrastructure assessment is the difference between a good investment and a catastrophic one. He paused. I don't suppose you consult anymore. I thought about my workshop at home, the router table I had been meaning to use, the canoe I had been meaning to build, Saturday mornings. I'm selective, I said. Of course, he said. A companionable silence. I'd pay you very well to be selectively available to us, he said. I'll think about it, I said. I found Marcus in the kitchen a little while later, reviewing something on his tablet. He looked up when I came in and then looked down and then looked up again with the expression of a man composing something he had been composing for 20 minutes. Daniel, he said. Marcus. I didn't know, he said. About the Riverside Tower, he stopped, started again. Sarah's told me things, but I thought she was just, he stopped again. Being a daughter, I suggested. Something moved across his face that I chose to interpret generously as self-awareness arriving, slightly delayed. I called you a retired plumber, he said. I'm a retired plumber, I said. You know what I mean. I did know what he meant. I set my coffee cup down on the kitchen counter, marble, original to the house, beautiful, and I looked at my son-in-law for a moment. He was a good-looking young man, smart, genuinely talented at what he did, and he was sitting with the particular discomfort of someone who had made an assumption about someone else and been shown, in front of his boss and his colleagues and a pair of buyers, that the assumption was wrong. I had a choice about what to do with this moment. Marcus, I said, every person in a room knows something you don't know, usually several things. The ones who look like they know a lot, the ones who dress for it and speak for it and present for it, they're often the ones who are the most committed to the performance of knowing, rather than the knowing itself. I picked up my coffee cup again. Your buyers today are architects. They walked into a house that 2 inspection reports failed to properly characterize, and they walked out ready to make an offer, because someone told them the truth in plain language about what they were actually buying. That's it. That's the whole thing. Marcus was quiet. I'm not angry, I said, because I wasn't. And I'm going to say yes to Richard's consulting offer, so you and I are going to be in each other's professional orbit for the foreseeable future, which I think is going to be good for everyone. I paused, including you. He looked up. You have a good instinct for people, I said, and you're going to get better at the infrastructure stuff. Those 2 things together are formidable. A beat. Also, you should have your water heater at home checked. I noticed when I was at your place last Christmas that the T and P valve has some scale on it that I didn't love. He blinked. I'll come by next weekend, I said. Bring Sarah. The Whitfields closed on the Ashford Lane Colonial 6 weeks later, at $1,050,000, with a negotiated credit of $28,000 for infrastructure remediation. They hired a contractor of their own choosing, did the work in 3 weeks while they were still in their apartment, and moved in the week before Thanksgiving. I know this because Caroline Whitfield sent me a photograph. The front porch, the Japanese maples bare now in November, the windows lit warm from inside. In the foreground, just visible, the original divided lights of the sitting room window, the one she had stood at in the October light and decided she was home. She had written on the back of the photograph, "Thank you for the truth about the basement. The rest of it is exactly what we hoped." I pinned it to the board in my workshop, next to Richard Greystone's note from 2008. The canoe, it turned out, could wait a little longer. Some basements still needed reading. And I was, it turned out, still the best person in any room to read them, flannel shirt, work boots and all. Marcus never called me a retired plumber again, not because he was afraid to, but because he had learned what the word retired actually meant in my case. Not finished, but selective. Not diminished, but directed. Not invisible, just patient. And patience, I had found over 61 years, was the rarest and most powerful tool in any craftsman's kit. You don't rush a reading. You don't rush a diagnosis. You don't rush the moment when a room full of people has to reckon with what they assumed versus what is actually, plumbly, structurally, undeniably true. You just show up, you do the work, you let the system speak. They always do, eventually.